Trumpian tempest, the tumultuous first 3 weeks. What to make of Trump's prospective trade war? And what is behind the tariffs? And what is Trump's foreign policy? Gaza as Disneyland? Seriously? Just some of the musings of Victor Hill, the financial economist, consultant, foodie, writer, and host at the Master Investor Show. More on that later. Now, Victor, one commentator said that our last podcast was very good and interesting, albeit depressing.
Oh dear.
So,
Well,
Victor,
good morning, Sarah, and thank you for your wonderful introduction. You're always so generous in your comments. Undeserved, I think. Well, was it depressing? I mean, I try to be a realist, but as I said last time, is the glass half full or half empty? One must try to be alert to the upside as well as the downside. So yes, Trumpian tempest. I mean, when we spoke a month or so ago, right back at the beginning of the year, I think I said that Trump was making the weather, even though he had yet to be inaugurated as 47th president of the USA. Well, you might say now, since January 20th, when he became president for the second time, the political climate, the global political climate, has changed. And every morning we awake to learn the latest pronouncement from the Donald and what the market reaction might be. So look, tariffs, that's probably top of the agenda, although there's quite a lot going on around the Trump administration. We knew that Trump was going to threaten tariffs against the major trading partners of the USA. And we had been forewarned about that. We didn't realize that it would manifest itself quite so quickly and what the consequences would be. So let's just take a step back. Trump did not initiate a trade war, or hasn't done so yet. The system of globalization, whereby there was global free trade, has been in decline for about 10 years or so. So let's just recall, one, the Biden administration did not undo any of the tariff measures of Trump 1.0, the first Trump administration. Two, the Biden administration imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. That's already happened. That's an accomplished fact. Three, the European Union has been erecting tariffs to protect its own industries steadily over recent years. Most recently, just last year, they imposed a 35% tariff on all imports of Chinese electric vehicles. Of course, in order to protect their own automobile manufacturers, who are very much under threat from the Chinese right now. So, Trump didn't invent tariffs, but he's using the threat of imposing them in order to get results. You might say that is a negotiating tactic, but let's look at what has happened so far. First of all, he threatened 25% tariffs on America's two neighbors, Mexico and Canada. And within 24 hours of announcing them, a moratorium was imposed because the Mexicans promised to rush 10,000 Guardia Civil, their policemen, to the frontier with the USA, and mostly along the Rio Grande River, which forms the boundary between Texas and northern Mexico, in order to forestall the traffic of illegal migrants going into the USA, and also the transport of illicit substances such as fentanyl. Now, this is no laughing matter, because 80,000 American citizens died last year due to fentanyl poisoning. This is a scourge across the American population, and it particularly affects people at the lower end of the economic spectrum. So then he imposed additionally 10% tariffs on all Chinese goods, including these sort of small items which arrive in little packets and parcels by DHL and the other logistics giants, which formerly were subject to this de minimis rule, whereby small packets would not be subject to tariffs. Now, what is the background in terms of the overall trading balance? Well, America is running a deficit with its major trading partners. So in the case of China, it's around $300 billion. With the European Union, it's around $260 billion. With Japan, it's around $65 billion, and a similar figure for Canada, albeit that most of Canada's exports to the USA are hydrocarbons, basically oil and gas. So Trump thinks that America has outsourced too many jobs and too much of its manufacturing base to the likes of Mexico, Vietnam, Malaysia, and others, and that it's time to get those jobs back. And tariffs are a possible means of doing that, but in the meantime, he can use it also as a measure of foreign policy to coerce partners into doing things which actually rebound to his political credit. Do remember, his support base emanates in large part from smokestack states like Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, where people feel that they have lost out, and where, despite the enormous wealth generated by the tech trillionaires, living standards have actually been in decline or static. So that's kind of the background to where we are. I do agree that a lot of people are very exercised by this advent. The Europeans have said they will retaliate. Let's see how it goes. It might not turn out to be as disastrous as many have supposed.
So, Victor, I just don't think that there's enough trademark sharpies in the world to sign all the executive orders that are being signed by Trump at the moment. I wonder what he is signing in terms of the
I
war.
think that felt pen must have worn out by now. This is a whirlwind of executive orders. Yes.
It certainly is, and he's throwing them into the crowd, his adoring public. But I'm wondering if there's any signatures on paperwork associated with the war in the Ukraine. Is that now in its end game?
Well, I do think it's in its end game, Sarah, and we now know that Trump has spoken to Putin at least once, and that probably the main principles along which the war will be ended have actually been agreed. That's quite possible. That's my conjecture. Now, knowing the Russians a little bit as I do, and knowing their love of symmetry, I would not be surprised if there is a major announcement on 23rd of February, which will be the third anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and which will also, by the way, be the date of the German federal elections, which I think we might talk about. And to the extent that, a ceasefire is possible. It may not be the end of the war as such. Now, what does Putin want? Well, he wants international recognition that Crimea is Russian territory. He wants to maintain possession of those areas of eastern Ukraine which Russian forces have occupied. And he also aspires to get additional dollops of the Donbass, which is less realistic. He wants to see an end to sanctions against Russia, which are costing dear. We now know that supply chains in Russia are under great stress. There are huge labor shortages. So, the Russian economy has survived longer and, more effectively than had been anticipated, but it is under stress, as is reflected by the value of the ruble. And fourthly, he wants Ukraine to be neutralized. That means an international treaty which prevents Ukraine from joining NATO. And I suspect that Trump and co may in fact grant him all those four, and that there will be a peace treaty whereby the frontiers of rump Ukraine are guaranteed, but that it will never be allowed to join NATO, or at least for a period of 20 or 30 years or whatever, much of the rest of my lifetime. Will Ukraine be permitted to join the European Union? Well, there will be those who aspire to that. But I'm hearing that the Germans don't want it because it's just going to cost too much money to rebuild Ukraine. And Ukraine is not ready. It is not, compatible. It is not fully aligned to European principles, politically and economically. So there will be some kind of package of a recovery program put into place, but I don't think that Ukraine is either going to join NATO or become a member of the European Union.
So, what is all this talk about rare earth metals in the Ukraine? Do you think Putin's
Well,
guy in that package?
this is very interesting because this was not something that has been to the fore hitherto. But it does appear that Ukraine is sitting on quite large deposits of some of these rare earth metals and other minerals as well. I mean, it's a large territory, and it's also a very fertile one. And some of the most interesting mining possibilities reside in the east of the country, which are already under Russian control. But I'm sure, given what we know about Trump's mindset and that of the people around him, I'm sure that this will be one factor in the overall equation. So America will be wanting to open up Ukraine to mineral exploration and indeed as a market for their products.
Now, in a minute, I'm going to come back to the tech trillionaires that you
Yes,
mentioned earlier on.
tech bros, yes.
Tech bros. I'm going to come back to that because I just want to talk about Germany. You've talked about Germany twice now. Germany goes
Yes,
to polls 23rd of February in what
yes,
Musk has called the most consequential European election since the war. Why is he
correct.
saying that?
He thinks that this is make or break for Europe. And what he sees from his perspective is that Europe has become subject to this woke mind virus, and that has inhibited the control of European borders, and that, as we know, huge numbers of migrants I hesitate to use the word flooded in because it's so controversial. It's so heavy with connotations. And indeed, the French Prime Minister, François Bayrou, got into big trouble last week when he said that France had been inondée, flooded with migrants. So, one has to use one's words very carefully. But it is a huge issue, and most people regard it as such in Europe. And what you see in terms of the German elections, looking at the most recent opinion poll, which came out sometime last week, you have the CDU, which is the sort of right of center historic party, which was once headed by Angela Merkel, under a guy called Friedrich Merz. They're on about 30%. Then you have Alternative for Deutschland, AfD, which Mr. Musk apparently supports, and he has invited German friends to support them. They're on about 21%. And then well behind you have the SPD on about 15%. That's the party of Olaf Scholz, who's the current chancellor. And then below them, you have the Greens on about 13-14%. So the reason why on 31st of January, there was this huge bust up in the German parliament, the Bundestag, was that the CDU, the sort of analog to the UK Conservatives, actually started to do deals with AfD over some legislation around the whole controversial topic of immigration. And in so doing, they broke a taboo. The Germans call it a firewall, die Brandmauer, and they basically broken the taboo that you don't treat with the AfD. And what that has done, and by the way, Angela Merkel came out very vociferously in criticizing her successor on that score. What this has done is to open the possibility, and it's no more than that post-elections, with the CDU as the largest party, they may do some kind of pact, an electoral pact, or a pact in the Bundestag, rather than a coalition with AfD. And that would bring AfD much closer to power than anyone had ever dreamed possible. So that's why the whole of the election is absolutely, pivotal both for the future of Germany and indeed for the future of Europe, where the right is now gaining ground across the board quite rapidly. I mean, I have to say, I don't think these people are fascists, as they have been accused of being. That they are, I call them the new right. Um, so Mayor Khan and others can talk about, they can equate this with the rise of fascism in the 1930s. I think it's something rather different for reasons we could discuss.
Well, it's very interesting that Elon Musk is casting his vision globally and not just in the US. But can you remember the night of the inauguration, the day of the inauguration? There was the tech bros,
Yes.
the paparazzi were spending a lot of time getting close-ups of the tech bros. Why did Zuckerberg look so ill at ease, do you think?
Oh, that's a wonderful photograph that you're referring to, and it's kind of like a detail from a huge Renaissance painting like by someone like Veronese, the Alexander's entry into Persepolis or whatever, and you've got these tech bros all in one corner of the Capitol, and they're all in very striking poses. And Zuckerberg looks so ill at ease and so sort of, uncomfortable with his situation. And then you have Bezos staring towards the camera. And then you have Satya Nadella with a sort of a wry smile. He's the CEO of Microsoft with a wry smile on his face. And then you have Musk at the end looking somehow as if he knows something that we don't. It's all very intriguing. But when I saw that photograph, I thought of a historical parallel, which you may or may not find interesting, which is that if you go back to the inauguration of Vladimir Putin in his first presidency, he was considered to be a breath of fresh air, remember? This is going back in 2000, at the beginning of this century. He was surrounded by the oligarchs. And you know what happened to them? One by one, they were picked off. And, unfortunates like Khodorkovsky ended up in a cage, didn't he? And then sent into exile. Whereas others like Deripaska were, forced to toe the line and were allowed to keep their fortunes, but only under stringent conditions. And you know that, if you listen to some of Trump's cheerleaders like Steve Bannon, who has a bit of a reputation that we could discuss, but who is nevertheless influential and a podcaster, no less. He's talking about, putting Zuckerberg in prison if he steps out of line. So there's some quite, intemperate language going on in the background. And for the moment, the tech bros have decided to toe Trump's line. And we have Zuckerberg talking about masculine values, whereas he was, really keen on equality and diversity and inclusion at one stage. So, as I say, the climate has changed. But for as long as the tech bros remain on Trump's side and useful to him, they will continue to prosper, no doubt.
And to use one of your phrases, it's almost as though Trump decides to do a Putin and bring about the twilight of the oligarchs, bar one. I'm just wondering, how much power does Musk really wield?
Well, Musk stands out as, in almost every conceivable way, exceptional. But let's just consider what he's doing right now. He runs. It's not a federal agency. The Department of Government Efficiency is not a federal agency. It's merely a part of the White House staff. So his role is advisory. He does not have any executive power. He is what we in the UK would call a SPAD, a special advisor, surrounded by other special advisors. If he has a budget, it comes out of the White House admin budget. Now, already he's caused some ructions because he's been requesting information of a sensitive character like payroll data for the various state agencies. But in a way, he's just sort of going through a kind of a very augmented time and motion study to work out, which parts of the government are working and which parts are not working. Now, in the meantime, there are other people doing something similar. And in particular, there is a federal agency which is very powerful and very influential, and it's called the Office of Management and Budget. Unlike our Office of Budget Responsibility, it has real teeth. And a man has just been appointed to chair this federal agency by the name of Russell Voigt, and he calls himself a Christian nationalist. And he is beginning to imagine things which are, would have been unimaginable under the Democrats, such as closing down the FBI altogether, which is considered to be a serpent's nest. And some insiders have called Voigt Trump's Thomas Cromwell. You remember Thomas Cromwell was the man that Henry VIII sent out to close the monasteries. And he's not going to close monasteries this time. He's going to be closing federal agencies. And that will have all kinds of repercussions and consequences, not least for the budget, but there will be great political controversy. But at the moment, Trump is in the ascendant. He's become president for the second time with a majority of the popular vote. He has a majority in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, and the Supreme Court is pretty much on side. He's riding high, and there's not much that can dislodge him for now.
My goodness, I could easily go down a rabbit hole where Homeland Security is concerned, but unfortunately, we don't have time. You did mention the OBR, so let's come back to sort of terra firma blighty, and
back to the UK. Yes, okay. Where
I'm,
we are.
I'm just wondering what the fiscal situation is. We heard from the Bank of England last week when it reduced interest rates, and the OBR. You sort of suggested it's pretty toothless, but people do listen to what the Bank of England and the OBR's predictions are. So Rachel Reeves, 26th of March is
Yeah.
next sort of big fiscal event for us here in the UK. But leading up to that, what decisions do you think she's got to make?
Well, she's going to try to balance the books in an extremely deteriorating, fiscal scenario. And let me just share a couple of things. First of all, the long sought growth that the Labour government made its mantra is proving very elusive. And just last week, the Bank of England cut the growth forecast from 1.5 to 0.7% for this year, 2025. Moreover, inflation, although it's just ticked down from 2.5 to 2.4, according to the December figures published in mid-January, it's likely to increase. And in fact, inflation is ticking up across Europe and in the US as well, for a number of structural reasons. That means that it's less likely that there will be further interest rate cuts. Additionally, unfortunately, one of the consequences of the Reeves budget of 30th of October is that employment costs have risen substantially, plus, of course, the advent of new employment regulations, meaning that, for example, a new employee is entitled to sickness benefit from day one, which means that the period of probation, which our generation found normal, has effectively been abolished. You become a fully entitled employee from the moment you sign the contract. That's going to come into effect in April, plus the impact of the increase in employers' national insurance contributions. This is already leading to automation. One example of this is that I don't know if Next is the biggest clothing retailer in the UK, and they're replacing a lot of their checkout staff with automated checkout machines, which we hitherto have associated with supermarkets, which somehow changes the shopping experience. Don't you think, Sarah, that if you don't have interaction with a human being at the checkout, arguably it's a less satisfying experience. But the upshot of all this is that I think we're going to see an uptick in unemployment, which will become manifest over the summer of this year, and it could be significant. Now, you've also got, alongside that, you've got 3.2 million people in the UK, 3.2 of our fellow citizens who are of working age, but who have successfully applied for incapacity or disability benefit without any obligation to look for work. So you have a huge chunk of the potential working population who are effectively idle. In fact, that's costing something like £65 billion a year. If you compare that with our defence budget, which was 56, 57 billion pounds in the current financial year. So we're spending more on paying people to stay at home than we are on defending the country. Then you've got the cost of servicing the national debt of around just over 2.8 trillion pounds, because interest rates have been going up, and in the gilt market, the yields on government bonds they've attenuated slightly actually since we last spoke. But this morning I checked, the 10-year gilt is yielding around 4.5%, which means that when the government issues new money, it will have to offer investors a yield of something similar. So the total cost of servicing the national debt, paying interest on the national debt in the current fiscal year will be in excess of 100 billion pounds, which is getting on for the scale of the education budget in England. You've still got a fiscal deficit which is running at around 5% of GDP. Okay, in France it's 6%, but it's too high. Remember, under pre-pandemic, the Tory government had got the deficit down to 2.7%. Then the pandemic hit, and of course, the fiscal calamity resulted. So, Reeves's options are not very pretty, and she will be under increasing pressure from the Treasury and from insiders to cut benefits. But if she does so, that will be extremely popular with Labour's national constituency. What I call the clientele, people who will always vote Labour because they know Labour will look after them in some sense. So her situation is not enviable, and I do fear that she's made things only worse. As for the investment outlook, well, it worries me, Sarah, that we are deindustrializing very rapidly, and you only have to look at Ineos has closed the last oil refinery in Scotland at Grangemouth. Now they're closing the ethanol plant. JCB is laying off workers. Dyson has been laying off workers. The North Sea oil fields are being discontinued. Our steel industry is in decline. Even the goose that used to lay the golden egg, the City of London, is in rapid decline, I'm very sorry to say, with the stock market actually shrinking in size. So these are all causes for concern.
I don't want you to worry too much, because I need you to be compare and host at the Master Investors show. We're not quite at the point in our conversation where we're going to talk about that, but very briefly, it sounds as though Europe has lost its mojo. However, for
Yes.
all the economic weakness and political instability, European markets have fared well year
Correct.
to date. I'm just wondering, can that last? FTSE 100 hasn't done that badly.
No, it's done actually quite well, and there are reasons for that. I mean, FTSE 100 component companies have a lot of their international revenue denominated in dollars, and therefore, when the dollar increases in value, their income stream actually increases in sterling terms. So I have to say that the FTSE 100, especially, less so the FTSE 250, is almost entirely detached from the British economy. It's all about companies doing things overseas, and you've got Kazakhstani mining companies in there, which have nothing to do with the state of the British economy. So yeah, okay, the FTSE has done relatively well, but when you consider it was at 7,000 at Millennium Eve, and it's now 8,700. If you exclude dividends, it hasn't done very well at all. Whereas the US markets are up by 6 to 8-fold over the course of the last 25 years. So it depends what you compare it to. European bourses also have done reasonably well, despite the prevailing economic gloom, with very little growth in Europe and indeed a recession in Germany, according to the most recent figures. And there are some companies, as we discussed last time, which are doing relatively well. But I would say, Sarah, that the action is going to be not in the equity markets, but in the bond markets going forward. And what I foresee, possibly as early as the third quarter of this year, is a kind of a reckoning in the bond markets as governments are forced to pay up in commensurate with the levels of risk that they represent. And I think we're going to see something that could be akin to the European sovereign debt crisis of 2011 to 13, when suddenly the bond markets went very wobbly and all kinds of spreads started to soar. And that will be very unnerving, and it will destabilize the entire financial system. I don't foresee that rates will be able to be cut significantly this year. And in fact, I do think that we've got back to something which is historically more normal, because the problem with the central bankers, and I've said this before, the priestly caste, as I call them, they're extremely bad at predicting the future direction of interest rates. And after the financial crash of 2008-9, they convinced themselves that interest rates were going to remain low forever. And of course, most people who look at these things historically thought that there would come a point when there would be, this is a historical anomaly, and there would be, an inversion at some point. And that happened post-pandemic, when suddenly, as a result of all these disrupted supply chains, we were hit with a tsunami of inflation, which to some extent still persists. By the way, interest rates are going up in Japan, India, all over the world, not just in Europe and North America. So that's the way I see it.
Right. We're going to have that same comment lobbied against us. That very, very informative. But
could I just say something optimistic?
Yes.
If we have time. Okay, yep. So there are 3 technologies which are going to transform our lives completely, Sarah, and they're coming up fast. We don't realize just how current they are. One, of course, is AI, which we talk about a lot. And there's a lot of talk about AI, which is very confused and misleading. But it will change our lives, and is doing so already. But the other technologies that are not so much in the headlines are nuclear fission, which it means possibly that we can have access to unlimited electricity produced very cheaply. And of course, quantum computing, which is closely associated with AI because it will facilitate it. So we are living at a time of technological marvels, and we might even get to Mars under Trump. You don't know. They could have an unmanned mission to Mars tomorrow. The technology is there. The real question, as Sir Martin Rees pointed out recently in the FT, is the human risk of sending astronauts to Mars, knowing that they might not come back. So it's very exciting times, if not quite daunting ones.
You'd make a great careers tutor. I think any younger person watching this, right, well, I know what career I should be preparing myself for. But March the 29th, 2025, this is when you and I will see each other in person at the Master Investors Show. I'm hoping that we'll get you onto the stage, not just to host panels, but to give us the benefit of your wisdom and experience. It's going to be a cracker of a show this year. Are you ready for it?
Well, I'm really looking forward to it, and I gather that we've had record number of subscriptions, and that the auditorium will be full, the design center will be buzzing as it always is, and we will have a huge range of interesting exhibitors and speakers, and I can't wait.
It'll be wonderful. And I look forward to seeing you in person. Victor,
Likewise.
it's been a pleasure. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Bye bye.